Hello and welcome to the Grayscale to Color Process tutorial part 2. In last month's part 1, we mainly covered how to prepare a good grayscale base before we even begin coloring. So in this video, we'll be talking about the coloring process itself, from a complete grayscale base to a finished product and all that it entails. So here, let's take a look at a recap. So as you can see here, last month we did preparing a sound grayscale base and all these little things that come along with that. So in this month, we'll be covering points 2 and 3 here below. And we'll also be talking about these 6 points as we move along. So without further ado, let's get to the painting itself. So this is where we left off in last month's tutorial video, part 1. We've taken care of the local values, the lighting, and took the chance to do a bit of composition planning and arranging value blocking and all that stuff related to value. Again, you can watch that video on the main page. It's up there for everyone, probably forever, so feel free to take a look at that before you jump into this video. So in this video itself, we'll be talking about how to transition from this particular stage to a complete product, as you can see here. Right, so adding color, adjusting the composition, and tuning a lot of things that turns a draft into a finished painting. So back to our draft here, and the first thing we like to take a look at is in item number 2 and sub item number 1, right? Use reference material. So sometimes we're not too sure on what kind of color scheme that we like, so we look to reference for inspiration and kind of some assistance. So in this case, right, in this image here, I've decided that, hey, I really like the look of this street on a grayish day, right? It kind of captures the sort of busyness and compactness of the kind of setting here, and I think it will be a suitable color scheme for our piece here as well. So on images like this, where there's an obvious sort of color tone going into it, I feel that it is actually quite helpful if we use a color filter on our draft to essentially get a foot in the door. Right, of course, there's a lot of very specific painting that still needs to be done later, but for the very first part, I think it is good to use some Photoshop or digital painting tools to give us a hand. So in order to add this overarching color tone, for example, I will use something like selective color. And then I noticed that generally it kind of feels almost warm in a cold kind of setting here. It's hard to describe, right? But as you can observe the reference image here on the left, I'll try to sort of get close to the color tone before we do anything else. So as you can see here, I've just played the sliders. Right, to sort of try and get the effect that I want. Of course, you're not going to get it precisely or even very closely at all, because a lot of the times, right, there's so much different color and so many different interactions that go on that you cannot obviously hope to cover all of it, right, just by using one simple layer. But the idea here is to inject some of the common colors that cover a lot of the space, so that we can have a foothold in the painting and then you can get going from there. So this is kind of the color tone that I've settled on, right? So at this stage, right, obviously we've managed to remove the grays from this image, which I think helps a lot when we are just starting from a pure grayscale, right? Especially when there are so many items that need to be colored and we're just starting from pure grayscale, it can be a bit tough to be like, okay, let me add color on this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then, it's really hard to read the image as you proceed because of just the sheer amount of time it takes to address all the different colors in the scene. Right, and luckily for us in here, right, we here have the chance to use some digital tools like selective color to help us get a head start. So after this, right, what I will do is to start introducing some of the main colors that we have in the scene. So let's say we want a red colored vending machine, right? We could just casually paint in some red. So the idea here is, for me personally, I like to add the color itself pretty softly. Like for example, I pick a red that is somewhat in the range of what it should be, and then kind of layer it on. And then as I paint, I don't use full opacity, and I use a color picker to sort of blend, right? Or extract the blended color from this particular painting, or rather from this particular canvas, right? So the thing about this red is that it's mixed with this sort of bluish gray that we generated with our selective color layer. So essentially kind of mixes it, right? And then we can essentially color pick it and add it on. And then because we have sort of this underlying color layer here already, it really helps us sort of keep our colors harmonized, right? As long as you don't go too vibrant straight off the bat. So as you can see here, right? Point number 4, right? We want to sort of maintain color harmony. Of course, right? That means we can use a lot of different colors. That doesn't mean we can only use very few colors, right? But in a sense, we want the colors or objects that carry those colors to look like they still belong in the same scene. So, right, so here's usually where I think a good point to start off is by using and blending in this red, right? We can kind of help ourselves get a feel of what this vending machine might look like in this context. And then we can think, okay, so what else is there to color, right? For example, these signs in the background, we could try adding some color to them as well. Let's say we want a blue, right? And then we can lightly touch in the blue, like so. And let's say we think the blue is a bit too strong, we can tune it back down by introducing this tone from other areas of the painting and just painting it in like this, right? So again, right, the reference comes in handy here, right? Because since we're following the color scheme of this particular piece, we can kind of look at it and say, oh, so this is how blue sort of shows in this sort of lighting situation. And then you can get a good idea from what it's like. And the same thing goes, let's say we're on a red sign here. We can just throw in a bit of red, add a bit of saturation as needed, and then just paint it. Alright, so this is sort of where we start, right? We try to account for all the little colors, not little colors, right? But all of the major sources of obvious color that come in. Because we always have to start somewhere, right? So rather than starting from the very, very small things like, oh, maybe this bicycle here has like a small, tiny red light, you know, here or something. Right? Rather than start from here, right? We can start from bigger items like this particular vending machine, or let's say this is like a hazard yellow, and then we can introduce the hazard yellow here that the cat is sitting on, right? And all these things are sort of what comes next, introducing local color, right? As you can see here, point number 2, basically understand and introduce local color. And if we fast forward a bit, right, this is kind of what we did, what I tried during this stage, just as what I demonstrated. And later on, right, so this is sort of what I settle on. And when it comes to adding some skin tone for the character, it of course is a bit harder to, you know, just take a color and then paint it, right? Let's say the skin tone's a bit red, and then we try to paint color. It's doable, of course, but I find it faster especially since that we've already done some of the value setup and some of the volumes on the character. We'll just use a soft light layer here, right? So that is what I did. Added a soft light layer. For example, open a new layer, add a soft light layer, and then add something like a reddish color, right? So it's just too much red, and then we can tone it back a bit. And let's say we just paint the skin tone areas with this brush, right? It's as simple as this. Of course, we can use erasers to kind of get rid of the excess, right? And it's a really quick and dirty process. It really doesn't take very long, and you can get it done very easily. So, yeah, so there it is. We get to preserve the value relationship, but we also get to introduce color. So that's obviously very useful for areas of the drawing where things are a bit more precise, and especially if you've already done some of the work. right? And of course, right, let's say we want to tune it a bit, and we can open something like hue saturation tools, and then kind of make it less saturated or more saturated, right? So again, this is where we try to figure out how deep the skin tone shows up. And of course, reference is helpful as always, right? To tell us, okay, so how bright is the skin tone that appears? Of course, it varies from a lot of different factors. So of course, and again, right, it's up to your own judgment to figure out these small things as well. Again, keeping in mind that we have to maintain the color harmony, making sure that all the things look like they belong in the same scene, and then make sure the local color itself doesn't get lost. Because for example, if we say tune the skin tone to be too desaturated, right? Even in this context of a very grayish day, right? This character will appear very, very strange, right? Almost like a zombie with grayish skin. So we don't want that. So we have to make sure that it's at the right level. And again, references are our good friend. So moving on from here, now that we have introduced color into the piece, right, quote unquote introduce color into the piece by kind of tackling a lot of the big areas where color is the most prominent. And we can now move on to start thinking about how a lot of the lighting works in the scene as well. Aside from, right, the basic top-down lighting that we've already established in the value stage, right? Because this is where we start to paint the piece towards completion, we have to think about the smaller things that start to crop up one by one. So before we do that, right, let's take a look at this current progress here. So as you can see, a lot of the big items like the vending machine, the character skin tone, and the signboards in the back, plus the yellow tile wall, right, that I've actually added in conveniently thanks to the selective color layer, right? Conveniently, it decided that this sort of value range should be a little bit yellow thanks to how I tune things, and with the help of this reference. So right, very nice. We don't have to manually paint this wall ourselves. But of course, if we do have to, right, we can of course still use the same soft light layer, and let's say we want a very light yellow tint on it, or we're going to make it more orange, right? So this is how we'll do it. Right, so again, in this first stage, the idea is to introduce local color, and introduce local color in the most prominent places so we can quote unquote make the biggest progress as soon as possible. And the purpose of this is not to rush through the process, but to kind of give ourselves a good starting point where we can evaluate how this piece can further proceed. So next, as you can see here, I added in some lighting from the vending machine in the background, right? Not really in the background, in the mid-ground kind of. And for this kind of process, it's simple. Again, there's no secret technique or magic stuff going on here, right? Simply just kind of take a brush of your choice and sort of start adding in strokes to areas where it is relevant, right? Keeping into account the direction of the light. So the light is coming from a bit far back and it's coming down towards the character. So for example, you wouldn't see light in this area or this area, right? You see light sort of on the rim, on the edge, from our current vantage point. Right, you also see a bit of light on the hands here because it's not obscured by the body, but right, this area here is obscured by, say, the abdomen area of the character. So this is where the light hits, and then it casts a shadow into this area. Right, and a bit of shoulder will be visible as well, plus the neck. And since the character's head is sort of turned, or rather the character's ponytail is sort of like behind the head and exposed to the light, right, we could add a bit of lighting here as well. So this is how I would sort of set up this particular part of the process. So the point here is to start taking into account important elements in the piece, right? Like the pretty obvious lighting here. And then we can throw some onto this block here because it's right in the firing line for this light source. And on, say, maybe the cat's whiskers and body as well. Right, so this is sort of how the next step goes. And of course, we can do some reflection on the floor as well. And here is where the experimentation begins. So as I've said, we've sort of reached a point where if we look at a thumbnail, there's a good amount of color in the piece. It may be a subdued sort of theme, but we have assigned essentially a lot of the major colors so that the piece itself actually reads reasonably well, and then we can move on from there, right? So at this point in time, I'd like to start experimenting by adding details like, okay, so what if this object is this instead, and what if, say, the character is carrying like a trash bag, right? Little very flexible things that you can play with. So for example, let's say I do not want the light on the ground. Let's see what happens if I kind of replace it with a texture and stuff like that. Experiments that sort of move the piece forward to what you want. Right, so for example here I tried, okay, what if we add a bit more red in like the background here, how does it work? Again, this part of the process is really flexible. It's up to you as to what you want to add, how you want to craft the piece. And for this particular part, it's not really pertinent to introducing color per se, but it's also really integral to the painting process, right? Even though I like to break things down very systematically, I would still say a lot of times there's a degree of flexibility that needs to be present for us to actually enjoy or operate at all, right? Because it cannot just be like a machine where we just do one thing at a time, right? We can make use of the flexibility of the kind of 2D painting medium, right? Compared to, let's say, if we're doing 3D modeling and stuff. In a 2D painting medium, we can really quickly add a lot of things and try out new ideas. So my personal opinion is that I personally would not want to waste that. So I like to take the opportunity in this stage where we have some colors and we have things somewhat set up, right? To take the chance and then experiment on and add different things. Right, so here let's say I want to tune the color settings a bit, and then we can just use, let's say for example here, we want to make the scene a bit more bluish. So again, we open a new selective color layer. And then let's say we make the scene a bit more bluish like so. Right, but if let's say we also want to retain the yellowness of the wall a bit more because it feels like the scene is blending a bit too closely together, we can select this thing on the right of this icon. That is a mask layer that actually comes default whenever you add a new filter or visual filter layer or whatever this thing is called, right? It comes with a mask, and then you can just lightly paint over it, adjust your opacity if needed, and then just kind of tune back the effect of the mask of the filter layer, right? Kind of sort of tune the effect back or tune it up. Right? Or you can just reduce the opacity of this entire layer as a whole to exactly what you want. Right, so this is again part of the flexibility that I just talked about. You want to be able to adjust your work on the fly as it develops, as you respond to what it looks like to your eyes. And of course, right, as we continue the process, I can, for example, adjust the silhouette of the character, because right now I intend for her to say wear this jacket, right? But right now it doesn't look too much like a jacket because it's sort of weird. It's like a shirt, but it's like a jacket. So to make things clear, right, we can, for example, be more decisive with the shape of the jacket, right? Make it a bit longer. Have like this puff in front of the abdomen area, right? And all these little things that kind of help convince the viewer that, or help convince ourselves as well that this is what we are creating. Right, now it looks more like a jacket, which is what I did here, right? I even extended the sleeve in my actual draft itself, and then also we've adjusted some little things here on the road. So as you can see, it's really organic, and this is where you pay attention to a lot of things that go on as you add color and as you work as you work on a piece as a colored piece, right? So you want to start focusing on the full impression that the scene gives you and start thinking about what you want and what you do not want in your piece. Right, and so right now, for example, I say, okay, what if we add an umbrella to the character and make it into a rainy day scenario? And this is just the idea that I had, so I took the chance to try it out, right? Roughly painting an umbrella, kind of giving it some simple shapes, right? Like roughing out the hand here. And then the purpose of this, right, is for me to sort of look at this upper right corner here, and then look at this particular image in upper right and go, okay, so, oh, this makes sense. The character is more dominant in the composition. The umbrella is very readable. It tells us that it's a rainy day. And okay, I like this particular change. So this is the kind of organicness that we see in the process of coloring, really. And I think coloring is actually quite loose, quite loosely being used here as well. So I took a small break and thought about how to continue with this tutorial, because one thing I suddenly realized is that, hey, you know, the introduce color systematically part of the process itself is sort of already done like 10 minutes ago, where we just, you know, added this selective color layer to sort of tune the whole scene in, and then added in this basic local values. And yeah, you know, in that situation, the scene in terms of color is pretty much 90% set, right? We've introduced all the colors that we wanted to, and now it's time to just really just deal with the small things and just continue painting. So I kind of reflected on that and sort of realized now that point 3 is really where all the meat is in terms of explanation and time being spent, right? In terms of complexity, it is strangely and deceptively simple, right? Because all you do is to quote unquote just paint based on your setup, which is steps 1 and 2, which are technically more rigorous, because you sort of have to account for different things and not leave out certain things that are important later on, right? But realistically speaking, right, most of the time and effort you'll be spent in really part 3, where you have to essentially paint and evolve as you're painting along with your painting, right? So you can recheck the colors, recheck the value placement, and then pay attention to if we need to add things, we need to subtract things, we need to alter some of the elements as we move along. Right, so with that in mind, right, we're actually mostly what we're talking about now is how to sort of continue painting from when you already have the desired general color setup that you want. So continuing from right where we were before, right, we can make small adjustments like this particular area on the floor here. We can straighten it, right, with a handy perspective grid that I've added in as well. Right, really very, very quote unquote almost grunt work that goes into this part, right? Straightening things out, making things presentable for the final part of the process, right? And here's also where we sort of just simply remember, right, what kind of colors that we are seeing in where, and what kind of colors we are seeing where, and all these kind of small things, right? Also taking into account the values as well from the very first stage. And if we've done the first 2 stages fairly well, this particular part should be quite easy. For me, it's mostly just using a color picker and then just straightening lines out and all these kind of stuff. Right, and so let's say we have a grid here on the wall. I can draw this particular grid in and then use a mask later on if necessary to sort of mask out the character and all these things. So very basic things. Right, and here you can see I introduce, say for example, a photo texture to sort of as a placeholder, right, to sort of figure out what kind of color arrangements I can have. And then later on we can of course paint over it and then work that into the painting in a sort of roundabout way, right? Again, this is sort of a visual, it's sort of like a visual placeholder again, right, to sort of tell us how it might look like with this particular setup, so we can save ourselves a bit of time. Of course, right, the key is to probably not use too much of it, because it can make a painting look really strange. Like half of it is photos, half of it is real. Of course, there are artists that do that really well, and in fact, I would say in a lot of like actual concept art, right, a lot of photo material gets used. But in terms of illustration and simple stuff like this, I would say to be a little bit careful of using too much of it at once, right? Especially if you're not too well practiced with it, right? Just like how I am not too well practiced with that. So I limit it to like a very complex area where I would need reference to help me figure out how it might look like. Right, so again, simple cleaning up work on the left side here. And then, right, big changes here, right? As you can see, all of a sudden, so many things appeared. So let me just take a moment to explain what happens here. As you can see, rather than having the sort of scene kind of bend inwards, I decided to try having it continue along this axis. So I thought about what items could probably fit into this area. Thought, okay, recycling bins would be good, and then like this sort of a wall in the back here. Right, and maybe have the recycling bins on top of the step. And then, right, and now you might think, okay, so how do you decide on the colors of these two recycling bins here? And honestly, the answer is not too complicated at all, right? So for example, let's say we just have a gray color bin here, right? And then we want to make this part green. So what I will usually do is to take a color picker, pick on this particular grayish area, and think, okay, so all I need to do right now is to make this surface greener than what it was. So if you think about green, it's a darker color than, you know, white. So I'm gonna tone down the values a bit, adjust the hue into like the sort of greenish range, and then up the saturation by a little bit, and then we just paint the green. And of course, right, in this case, for example, you realize I did not get it right on the mark. But do not worry, right? As I've said earlier before, you can always just reintroduce the sort of ambient color to your setup to make it a bit more harmonized. Right, so if it's still feeling too warm, we can just use the hue slider itself to make it cooler. Right, and then here we go. Right, it's a bit brighter than before, but hey, you know, a lot of the adjustment can also continue from here as well. Right, for example, making it darker. Right, adjusting the hue and saturation until it matches the rest of the drawing. Right, the same goes to blue. We take, let's say, for example, a white surface, and then say, okay, this needs darker and more bluish. And then throw in the blue and then blend it in with the surroundings again. And then of course, if let's say you can't quite figure out how exactly things should look like, or how bluish or greenish things look, it's time to look for reference again. For example, here we can see how green sort of manifests in this lighting, right? And how blue manifests in this lighting. So this kind of gives us an idea of how vibrant they can appear, or how dark they can appear, right? Because as you notice here, both green and blue are actually really dark and actually fairly desaturated just given the lighting conditions. So it's actually quite simple to handle this particular part. Right, and then of course during this stage we figure out sort of what kind of different things we want, and then just paint really well, casually almost, right? Just adding in straight lines like this, right? Adjusting, call out the stone blocks below the vending machine, right? And as we move forward, for example, remember that we had this complex photo texture before, right? It's time to get rid of it, right? For example, I capture some of the key colors that you might see in the vending machine and then just block them out, which also harmonizes it with the rest of the painting as well. And as you can see, we can adjust some of the scale. Yeah, really just adding in things like that, right? So for example, here I toyed with the idea of, okay, so what if this is like an aircon ledge? What if this isn't like what if it's just like apartment right behind? So toying with ideas, and of course painting the character themselves. Right, working in some lighting, working in the cast shadow from the umbrella, the reflection of the, say, the sky that's above onto the hair, and then just getting rid of rough lines where we don't intend for them to exist. Right, so just simple stuff like this. And then, right, from there on, we continue to just essentially repeat, because again, that's why I had this, had the reflection, right? So much of the process is just observing and adjusting potential issues and checking your big values to make sure they line up. It is almost unfortunate that I don't have more like zingers to drop or really big points to drop, but really a lot of the process is sort of testing this out and figuring how things work. So again, right now I've had an idea, say, okay, so what if we help to better sort of establish the perspective, and using the perspective grid by using this like zebra crossing that goes across the road. Right, so I drop down zebra crossing on the road and then just continue painting. Right, adjusting the size of the character's head because we were really sloppy with it in the draft. And then I decided, okay, so right now the drawing is looking fine, but I feel like the right side is looking too light almost, right? So we can just drop in this giant bush on the right, which I think nicely sort of encloses the character and the cat, right? And all these things are really just experimentation. If you ask me, is there any technical reason why you decided to include this? And I will be like, well, I'm not sure. The right side compositionally felt a bit quiet and a bit too light, right? So I wanted to try out to see if I can add something that resolves that. And I think this kind of like overgrown bush right in the back alley, I think fits quite nicely as well. And then we just continue to paint. Yep, and here you can see I use another soft light layer to sort of add in a bit of blue into her pants, which is supposed to be called like denim, right? Although I did not put a lot of effort into this, as you can see, but I think the color itself actually does have a significant effect, right? And adding this kind of like purple to the umbrella as well, and then just manually painting to adjust the forms. And then at this point in time, I felt this, okay, now the scene is a bit too constricted, right? We have this constricting bush here, we have this very constricting vending machine here, and then now the other side is also sort of closed in, right? So I basically just went all the way back to the beginning here, and then sort of grabbed this area and copied and pasted it back here. So again, right, this is one of the techniques I like to use. I don't immediately discard a lot of the old parts of the drawing. I keep them around because sometimes there are good ideas in them that I want to like quickly drop in to see if they work. Right, and as you proceed, again, right, in the name of maintaining color harmony and the balance between that and local color, for example, I have a hue saturation layer here that actually sort of makes these two recycling bins a bit dimmer in terms of color. And then we continue adding small details, like they'll do that on the vending machine, grades here, yeah, like very, very basic stuff that I think is self-explanatory, so I go through them rather quickly. Some textures on the grid, and then here we go into, here we go into a bit more detail, right? Adding some of the top-down lighting that hits these plants, working out sort of the texture of this, or rather the structure of this like underpass area here, and then adding like actual drawn-in details like signboards, bicycles stacked up, right? And maybe even try out some small little red accent lights in the corner here and there. And then this is, I would say, where the piece is pretty much 99% done. Right? There's really nothing too much that can go on here at this point in time. I'm satisfied with sort of how the overall arrangement looks, the overall presentation of the elements is fine. And so really now it's just dealing with the small details that come along. Now, as you can see here, I'm not happy with how the face is placed. So I sort of check, okay, so how did I originally have like the character's expression, right? So I use this chance to kind of restore the original pose and gesture of the character. Right, so it's a very organic process of adding color, and really it's step by step, right? So again, to do a quick recap of how the kind of color is involved in this process from essentially grayscale to complete painting. Right, firstly we took into account like the red of the vending machine, the skin tone of the character, sort of like this yellowish wall in the background, and then these two signboards here. And then as the drawing progresses and more things get added in, like we have this yellow part of the yellow part of this like concrete barrier thing, and then we have like these two recycling bins. We have like a couple of cans on the ground, right? A can up here as well, and then a bit of colored lighting in the background here, and then pretty much, yeah, the green in the plants. And so you can count almost all the colors here, right? With the exception of like this really assortment of colors in here, right? But aside from point of area number 9, right? Everything else you can count in two hands. The amount of areas where we deliberately add in color. So things are kind of deceptive, right? Sometimes you look at a complex scene and it feels like you almost have to color in an infinite amount of objects. But for me personally, in my sort of visual style, I like to essentially, again, capitalize on the most prominent parts, right? Like these 8 or 9 items. Make sure that they are accounted for, and then let the rest just fall in place. Right, and of course in this process, we also take care of other stuff, like making sure the material of asphalt lines up, right? Making sure like there are dots everywhere on the pavement to kind of indicate this is the asphalt material. And then, yeah, really, that is sort of how the drawing kind of ramps up, right? If we want to add in a bit more rain, we also have to start including things like a bit more reflections, like reflections from this object or for this sign across the road, reflections on the ground. And yeah, that's almost pretty much it. And here's the final product. You see, you adjusted the face a bit more and have like this little leaf over the cat to make things make a bit more sense. And that is the end of the process. So to do a quick recap again, today we managed to cover introducing color systematically, and then observing and then adjusting our painting as we move along very organically, introducing colors, following the simple rules here, and then just repeating that process almost ad nauseum, right, until you are done with the piece. And so that is it for this tutorial. Again, I feel like I haven't explained enough almost, and I would definitely like to do more of these kind of explanation videos in the future. So yeah, thank you for watching, and thank you for your support here on Patreon, and I hope to see you next month.